Excellent. So welcome, welcome, welcome to our WEAll talk for March. We have these on a monthly basis. So for those of you who are new here, a big welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate that you've come and you're interested in this topic. And for those of you who haven't met me, my name is Tobile Chittenden. I am based in South Africa, in Johannesburg. And yeah, my role at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is the network co-lead. So creating spaces for dialogue, for conversations, for connection and gathering. But the WEAll talk spaces are really for knowledge sharing and showcasing or highlighting different perspectives that are kind of challenging traditional economic models or frameworks or ideas. And so this is the space that we do this on a monthly basis, and it's an hour long. We have this on Zoom, and we really want to encourage you to be part of the conversation, share your thoughts in the chat as we're going through, but also we will be making space for you to bring your questions and comments and thoughts towards the end of the conversation as well. So if you haven't joined before, we do also have a lot of our talks on our YouTube channel. I'm going to share the link in the chat so that you can see it and be just immersed in some of the other chats that we've had. We'll talk topics. Last month, for example, we had Professor Derek Hamilton from the New School in New York, who spoke on building a human rights economy. So every month we have a bit of a different topic. But today we are very, very excited and just so honored to have two remarkable speakers with us, Liepollo and Rosebell Kagumire, who are both trailblazers in the fields of decolonial feminism and economic justice. And yeah, the topic itself, I guess, could be so many things. We have around 30 minutes to discuss this, but I want to encourage you to bring your questions towards the ends, but also to keep engaging with both of our speakers in the future in terms of hearing their perspectives, because there's only so much that we can dive into today. So just to share a little bit of an intro about the types of things our speakers have done and a little bit about their bios. I'm going to read it a little bit. Rosebell is a Pan-African feminist writer, and she's an activist and editor at African Feminism. I'll pop the link to that just now in the chat. But she works at the intersection of media, gender, and development. And in 2020, she co-edited a book, Challenging Patriarchy, the Role of Patriarchy and the Rollback of Democracy. She's a founding member of the African Feminist Collective on feminist informed policies and a council member at the NalaFem Collective. She's been recognized over and over again in so many different ways, from Advanced Media as one of the 100 most influential women in Africa. She was one of the international judges for the Trace Prize for investigative reporting. She has a background in media, conflict studies, peace studies, and also mass communication. So really excited to hear her thoughts and yeah, just ideas around this topic. And then Liepollo, or first name Lebohang, is very close to the WEAll family. She is a WEAll ambassador. But for those of you who don't know, she's a senior research fellow and political economist at a think tank called Trade Collective. She is respected as an activist, scholar, public intellectual, political economist, international movement builder, and decolonial African feminist. She's a fellow of the African Futures Lab and a member of the Walter and Patricia Commission on Reparations. And she's also worked on a lot of important pieces exploring decolonial well-being economics through across 7 countries. So also just an astounding speaker and thought leader in the space of feminist political economics, well-being economics, international development, international relations in relation to African positionality. And this is part of what we're going to be exploring today. So hopefully that gives you a lot of insight in terms of who we are speaking to. I think it's important, you know, people speak about giving flowers to people while they are still alive. And especially to women, we want to respect and honor all that they are bringing, and especially their time and the knowledge and the value that I know that they're going to bring to this conversation. So I really wanted to dedicate time to do that. So thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to spotlight our speakers for everyone so that you can see who we are speaking to. And hopefully they are showing up on your screen. First of all, thank you and hi. That was a mouthful, but I just want to say hello and welcome you once again. Really respect the both of you and just, yeah, want to reiterate how grateful we are for you both being here. But to get us started, to get us kind of into the zone of a little bit of who you are, a little bit about the work that you do, I would love to ask the both of you, how do your decolonial feminist perspectives intersect with the work that you're involved in? So kind of given us a vision of these intersections in the work that you're involved in, and how do they cross-cut, and your experience of that, so that the audience can get a sneak peek of how you're landing into the space. So we can start with Liepollo.
Thanks so much, Tobile, and thanks to everybody who took the time to be here. It's an impressive number, and it's a privilege to be in community with everybody here. Interesting question. I think the work of intersectional decolonial feminism it's almost a diagnosis. It's become my diagnosis for how I view the world. So firstly, viewing the extractive nature of global economics, which is what brought me also to the Wellbeing Economic family, the degrowth, post-growth family, as it were, and the heterodox community, of trying to examine why it is that our situation, our global and international relations seem to be so skewed in a particular direction, and skewed in the direction of minority power of the global north. And there's a history of that, of course. And I mean, that history takes us into the way that international trade and the international trade architecture has been designed to continue to be continually extractive, to be continually rather one-sided, and to privilege the minority world. And the second piece of this is then the continuum of how the labor is also extracted from the African continent, particularly to the rest of the world, Africa, Asia, Latin America. So it's really an ongoing trajectory of the way that, the ways in which empires, especially the US and others, have built themselves on, genocide, on extraction, on free and cheap labor. And this is a model that we see being continued even now. And I see a direct trajectory, and I've said this many times, between what we saw in the transatlantic trafficking of African people and the ongoing trafficking, extraction, labor migration as a result of globalization of Black and brown people to other parts of the world. And this is like basically a race, not even a race, it's a sprint to the bottom. So it's an extraction of our skills, it's an extraction of our personhood, it's an extraction of our labor, it's an extraction of our citizenship in the broadest possible way. And it's really an extraction of our humanity, which is why a lot of our best, most brilliant minds are driving cabs in New York and making beds in Paris, rather than being of service to many countries on this continent. So this is something that has beset me over the last 20, 25 years. And there's an intersection between globalization, of labor globalization, right? And the way that it feeds into this frenzy of international care economics, international social reproduction and internationalizing and externalizing what should really be locally used skills. So you have 150,000 nurses currently, South African nurses, and the same could be said for Kenya, Zimbabwe, and many other countries, Nigeria, Ghana, from where skills are being extracted at a time when our own healthcare services, public healthcare services, are in a state of crisis. Why are they in a state of crisis? They're in a state of crisis because of structural adjustment, the denuding of African, Asian, and Latin American states over the last 30 and 40 years, the retraction of the state as a protector, as a provider, and really the transition between the transition from people being viewed as citizens and now being viewed really as clients and consumers. So you buy your education, you buy your water, and if you don't have the means to contribute and to participate in that formal market economy, then basically your citizenship and your personhood, which is where I began, is then is in question and is displaced. And then what happens? We are then displaced as migrants further to go and service other economies. So all of this, this whole architecture of global economics, international relations, and the labor migration in the context of globalization is exactly where my work on decolonial feminism intersects, because it's hard to get away from a feminist, race, and class analysis of all of the above, and we could add many other binaries as well. I'll hand over to Rosebell.
Yeah, go ahead, Rosebell. I'd love to hear your observations and your experiences and the work that you've done as well.
Thank you so much, Lebohang. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Really pleased to be here. For me, in my work with a background in terms of storytelling and documenting and historicizing struggles of African feminist struggles and diaspora struggles, it's very important for us when you talk about decolonial feminism to understand that we know that the past is not the past, that history is not the past, and even the past that is not the past, right? Because who determines what past is remembered, what is memorialized, is a question of power, and we come with that to understand that what the system that dictates how we live also dictates what we remember about ourselves, and knowing that colonization was not a process that ended but continued, rather in a different form. So even when we're talking about decolonizing, it's not because we are trying to start for many countries in Africa, for example, in the 50s or 60s. It is the current ongoing ways of extraction and ways of knowing that colonialization is not a process of only political or economic, it's also cultural and totally affecting your well-being and the ways of knowing and your ways of being and your well-being ultimately. So it's insisting that to understand how today's world is being shaped, our worlds are shaped differently because of the disruption of the process of colonization that continues to happen in so many different forms. So we look at systems of whose ultimately whose life is counted when you're counting all the sorts of ways we try to count how our world is a well-being world, right? Whether people are counting how happy people are, whose life counts. At the end of the day, we ask those kind of narratives, and we know that often the history, even where we have seen women and other minorities have led the resistance movements in different parts of the global south, that they're always pushed to the periphery. And we know that colonization was also here to append all ways of systems society was organized and continues to be so. In the fact that African women had what Professor Tamale calls like African women were, first of all, affected as African people, like the rest of the people, but also really debased because of gender impositions from Europe that made it extremely difficult now and made it so binary that even, you know, decades after colonization, we are actually dealing with criminalization of gender expressions on the continent because this was introduced by colonization. And this indeed start being looked at as the culture, right? People defending what is colonial as their culture, because that's what the process of colonization does. That by the time it constantly undoes the work that people have done. And you're constantly trying to revisit history and telling people, hey, actually, it wasn't like that. It's never been like that. This is what colonization created. And oftentimes, I don't know, Lebohang, you look like you're the most minority. Like people look at you like, is that strange? Like, that's not it. This is our culture. But we see from that reinstating of colonial cultures that affected how societies were organized, what's the structure from gender, who introducing ways of domination from class to gender, to up to present day states where we see a lot of indigenous populations, what we call indigenous populations, not being able to participate fully in the economy because they have been disposed of their land. We see you know, what is legacy of colonization, like very harmful ways of what they call conservation, but it's not really ecological justice to those who lost their land and were pushed off their land. So in countries like Tanzania, Uganda, and many other African countries, we continue to see land dispossession of indigenous communities who don't have actual political power in the current setup of what we call democracy, which does not work for marginalized ethnicities that were forced to be part of a union and dominated in a colonial state. So it's very important for us to go back to know the process of colonization, what it did and what it continues to do, as very, very critical to any conversation about well-being, and feminism is concerned with that. In any colonial conversation, we have to bring in the intersectional ways of how different parts of society were derailed and reorganized and dominancy reinforced up to today, and how that continues to happen even on top of that in a globalized capitalist way, on top of extraction from our states. We have particular ways in which women, gender minorities, ethnic minorities are extracted further than actually many other people. So it's very important to look at that. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot there. Liepollo, I don't know if you want to respond. Before we move to the next question, the purpose of this conversation is to kind of bring perspectives, but also kind of share some alternatives and give a forward-looking perspective. But you were speaking a lot of the extraction that has taken place. And part of that just brought to mind, like, whose job is it? Is it, because I think this is the big question. We're hearing over and over again, bring a global South perspective into the room. So that would kind of be the solution in terms of bringing history, education, learning, understanding to some of these topics. How do you react to that? And what are the nuances of that statement of bringing a global South perspective into the room?
Yeah, sort of the parachuting in of the Black or brown person. And I think that there's the one thing is, I just want to pick up on what Rosebell was saying, which is it's so important as well. One of the things that comes out of decolonial feminism and understanding decoloniality is that it is a resistance to the relitigation of the past that we're seeing in some of the development studies, for example. And that's really important, which are quite racialized and quite aggressively dishonest is the only way I can put it. So, for example, think the good old days of colonialism. I think there was a survey which said that I think 27% of people in Japan, I don't know which 27%, 32% of Germans. You know, we've seen the statistics, and X amount of people in the UK feel that colonialism had its merit. And I think that it's important that the work that people like Rosebell and I think many people on this call do, is not to relitigate what were abhorrent acts, what were unmitigated and what are unambiguously terrible acts of terror, you know, state terror upon sovereign states, sovereign people. That's really important. And I say this because as well, in response to your question, is also that when we think around what development actually is and where it has evolved from, there's a sort of there's a definite north-south dynamic, or majority-minority world dynamic, as I always prefer to say, which suggests that the majority world needs to catch up with something, develop towards something. And I think the Wellbeing Alliance has developed some language, but I think the global tapestry of alternatives, which I'm also a part of, and I see my good colleague here, Vasna, also on the call, has developed even stronger language in that regard. And then this is the language that suggests that there are pluriversal ways of being, that there are multiple universes that we all inhabit in this world, and that this whole notion of the center and the periphery is in itself very colonial. It's not far off from them and us. I think, therefore I am, and this kind of civilizational manifest destiny, this really perverse logic of even occupying other people's territories, and this Christian imperative to civilize, you know, this civilizational obligation, as it were, which is awfully quaint and awfully toxic and awfully racist and just awfully awful. And when we think around that, then it brings us to the language of understanding that when we're talking about development in that context, we're talking about a development of an industrial complex that was built on extraction, as I've already mentioned, built on removal of people, on genocide, on things that really should never be repeated. And that if one part of the world says that another part of the world is catching up, then I don't think that we would want a situation where we're ever seen to be catching up to those levels of lack of personhood, lack of humanity. And I don't think that under circumstance, anybody in the majority world would feel compelled to exercise that kind of lack of humanity. So if we're talking about a development discourse, that whole construct, it has to be dismantled. I won't say decolonized, because that's also language that has to be used with precision, but it has to be dismantled. The notion that there are developed countries and developing countries, rich countries, poor countries. And I say this often, and I'll keep saying it, because these are not rich countries. These are countries that have become enriched and enriched by using the sort of the industrial colonial complex that I'm describing. Secondly, also to think around what it means then to be developing. If we're talking about development, then we're all developing. We should all be developing towards greater humanity. We should all be developing towards greater social egalitarianism. We should all be growing towards a feminist reality. We should also all be growing towards a reality that centers majority world sentiments, because not only are we the numeric majority, but also because this is the majority world feeds the rest of the world, feeds Europe and feeds the US and feeds the minority world with our talents, with our resources, processed with our foods, with our music, with our skills. A lot of the most brilliant minds that are running NASA and that are running, you know, Wall Street and so forth are from this continent, and not many generations ago, but first and second generation African people who unfortunately are lost to us. For people who might have watched Grey's Anatomy once upon a long ago, some of the technology that was featured, this is a fun fact, some of the technology that was featured, the respiratory technology that was featured in some of those episodes is from South Africa, and you'd never guess it. There's no sense in which there's anything that comes out of this continent. people who are eagle-eyed and we're watching some of the Superman franchise, and because I'm a mother of twins and teens now, and some of the Marvel action movies, will be aware that a lot of those were shot in Cape Town and in Johannesburg, and it was a thrill for us to watch Superman jumping off of clearly Johannesburg. It was like, this is our world. And I think the fact that it could actually be shot here and replicate a so-called northern experience, a so-called developed country, illustrates that this whole binary about developed and non-developed is really quite false. So we should all be developing towards something better. And I certainly think the minority world needs to be developing towards divesting of the delusion of inherent betterness, divesting of relitigating history and her stories, divesting of the idea that colonialism was a good thing. I think that's just awful. Divesting of the idea that African countries need aid. That's a complete lie, particularly when we understand that for every dollar that arrives on this continent, 2 or 3 more leave this continent, are extracted. So the African continent is actually subsidizing the rest of this world in ways that are immeasurable, not only geohistorically through the free labor of enslaved African people, through the cheap labor currently of our nurses, our teachers, people who are making beds all over the world and driving cabs all over the world. Not only geohistorically, but currently in a contemporary context through the minerals, the cocoa that is bought at hardly 5 cents a kg and comes back at us as Cadbury, as Lindt, as Nescafe, as hot chocolate, as Milo. All of these are subsidies that this continent and many parts of the global south, I mean, Latin America, the African continent and Asia, but I'll speak to this continent because it is the one with which I am most familiar in terms of the context, have been and the extraction continues, including the extraction of our true potential, our true personhood, and our true centrality, not as the periphery, but as an intellectual majority, a cultural majority, a linguistic majority, and I could go further and further and further. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Profound. So many nuggets there that, yeah, I think we'll pick up on in the rest of the conversation. But Rosebell, I saw you also had shared some links. I mean, this is your field, literature, language, this topic of positionality and the narrative around that. Yeah, I'd love to give space for you to also chip in here.
Thank you, Tobile. Definitely, I hear Lebohang and speaking on why it's very important to interrogate language. A language carries oppression, So if from debasing your own language to also imposing the kind of language to explain things that often really are happening to you, but it's really described in a different language that does not really fully capture people's humanity, who are the primary the people who are being extracted, and also introducing the fact that when we talk about care and capitalism, we see that this is not only what we would call the West or rich countries, but also countries that have quickly risen, of course, on biofuel, on fuels, on petrol industries. And we see right now the kind of extraction of labor going to the Middle East, and the situation, the crisis in the Middle East of African people. And oftentimes the dynamic is quite forgotten on the fact that this is historical movement, but it's been there. But the fact that the capitalist expansion in the Middle East, in the Gulf countries in particular, is also causing a very big challenge in terms of African countries exporting labor there, which would never, the amount of money paid will never, whether we we are counting, what's the word? And not reparations, but money sent back home by migrants, and countries really hell-bent on counting that as something great. But actually, you will never get enough money. That's why the system is rigged in a way that you're going to be disadvantaged. That you will take your best, you will invest in an education system. If someone finishes secondary school where you have spent so much public funds, and you're exporting them to do very menial job, which will never grow your own country in any way. So it's very, very important to see those emerging crossroads that we see, and also the fact that oftentimes when we look at someone posted on climate change, of course, it's very, very important to recognize that it was just, even after years of fighting by environmental activists, eco-feminists in the continent and the global south, were like, we are here where we are with climate change politics economically because of colonization. But this was something people have been pushing against, that actually for the first time IPCC, it's only 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that recognized the first time in their report on the state of the climate that colonization indeed is a cause of climate, the crisis we are in. That the amount of pillaging and environmental disasters that countries experienced and continue to experience as a result of colonization is something we must tackle. So I think like the decolonial feminist movement reminds us of that. Like, extraction is the heart of capitalism and expansion. Countries expanding at the expense of the rest, not just materially, but ecologically. That even those who are least, advancing and having their wealth taken away from them are at the same time the people that are most vulnerable to climate change effects. Right now in East Africa, you have a heat wave. South Sudan just closed their schools because there's a heat wave in South Sudan. While last year, Mozambique was one of the most hit countries in terms of climate change. And we see so many, of course, Chad, we see the Sahel region in Africa very much affected by climate change, but also finding those countries finding themselves at the nexus of global economies of extraction from Chad to Burkina Faso to Mali. And we can't really talk about well-being when people can hardly, have a roof over their head because of the sheer insecurity that these extractive global systems of colonization that continue to push ordinary people's lives to be in squalor. Millions of people displaced, in Africa right now. So these are the things that we have to think about. Like, the trade systems don't stand alone. They are backed by political calculations. We see countries for a long time, countries like Germany, were funding anti-immigration, any kind of leader that wanted to stop, that asked them, wanted money, were in the deal with them in the Sahel, from Sudan to the Sahel, to pay loads of euros to stop people from migrating. But at the same time, you have France, which continues to control 14 economies in Africa. Like, 14 countries don't even have their own money. France is in charge of that money. It's really crazy when you think about it. These are millions of people on the continent. And when you look at the migration crisis, when you look at the insecurity crisis, this is where most of it is happening. So there is no way France can continue controlling the CFA, the West African and Central African CFA, being printed in Europe, and African countries having no control over their own, decisions, financial decisions, because France continues to hold, and we continue to kind of move as if this is not happening, as if this is not colonization, as if colonization is a thing of the past. So it's very important to also recognize like the different dynamics that are happening on the continent, and the state of extraction and the state of neocolonization that happens is intense in different ways and disguised in other ways in other places. For the countries under the CEFA, it's very, very urgent that they can actually even put that stake to control their own, financial system, that to a certain extent, that it's not even existing for most of the people in 14 African countries. So we can't really talk about the well-being of anybody if that is the kind of situation that we live in, and it continues to not be a center of attention of the world, that actually France continues its colonization today, and that the consequences are clear, in terms of where the insecurity, we have coups after coups in these countries, because a lot of control is going in. The determining factor of who is in power is if France can continue to extract your country, and so many other places, so many other players. We see a lot of Gulf countries playing a big role in the war in Sudan because of gold. UAE controlling the gold coming out of Sudan and playing an active role in sustaining conflict. We see the ongoing crisis between in Somalia, who gets to have a port on Somalia, right? We see Turkey, we see Qatar, we see all these countries involved, actively involved. We see a small country like Djibouti hosting over 5 military bases of all the empires in the world, from Japan to China to European countries, to USA. It's very, very urgent that we see that. I think decolonization links the economics and the political systems that are actually continuing to destroy our humanity and refuse our humanity.
Yep, 100%. Sure. I am seeing a question in the chat. Well, it's not in the chat, it's actually in the Q&A box. And I think it speaks to kind of where we were going in terms of this conversation. So yeah, let me kind of merge these questions together. So Vasna has put in the chat, thank you for articulating the violences, the unequal power dynamics, the patriarchy, the racism. What are some of your thoughts in terms of homegrown Pan-African feminist paths? And that kind of spoke to kind of what we were thinking of sharing, is your experiences in terms of African alternatives, what you have seen. When Liepollo was speaking about we should all be developing, what are the things that are developing and that you'd like to share with this audience that have struck you, that you think are, exciting perspectives to bring in terms of alternative ways of thinking of the economy?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, the one is during the early days of the COVID pandemic, and I think when you talk about post-COVID, I think we should be cautious. A few of us on the continent put together, African feminists came together. I think Rosebell was part of that, but there were about 15 or 20 of us, right, who drafted a letter of demand to, at the time, the African Union envoys who had been tasked with going to get money, money for the African continent to absorb or to cope with the COVID pandemic. And at the time, the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, was the chair of the AU. So it is he that deployed these four eminent people from the WTO, from the African Development Bank. One of them is a former minister of finance in this country. But what's important about that is the demands and the way that this Afrofeminism was actually framed. And it really is quite instructive. It reminds us, firstly, that there is to be very mindful of the androcentric views of the world. It reminds us very much that we cannot behave as though this planet and this world are basically belong to people only, but that we are in community with many other people, and with many other species, with many other life forms. And one of the things that it spoke about was this need to appreciate that, especially during the COVID crisis, we needed to think much more intentionally around decolonizing our own attitudes as the world towards nature. The second piece was also to appreciate and to understand the extractive nature of these relationships. So this letter frames this very clearly. It takes us back to structural adjustment, and it also reminds us of the value chain and the chain of devaluation, as I often call it, which is the link, the trajectory between the African producer and the Western consumer, or even the African middle class consumer, as it's often cyclical, in fact. The third piece around that was also understanding that the COVID vaccine racism that we were experiencing at the time is actually a manifestation of ongoing forms of toxicity, so ongoing forms of racism. It was just the latest manifestation in a similar way, in the way that African people were supposedly people from Africa or DRC or Haiti at some point were supposedly and propagandistically and mischievously and completely contemptuously accused of being the carriers of HIV and really disgusting racist theories that were going around. Similarly, the COVID crisis was then often seen as a contagion coming from the majority world, even though it originally sprung up in the minority world. And some of the research that we did at the time showed that there were coping mechanisms within communities. So, for example, how I know that in South Africa, there were several communities who were trying to produce and barter with each other. So I'll give you bread if you give me milk. Then that's all. In fact, in my own geographic area, which is the East Rand, a lot of people did that. There was a sort of a bartering even of childcare in ways for which people, especially feminists and people who are women-headed families, were able to then leverage off of each other's time, skill, and capacity in different ways of communalism. We already have a history of communalism where, for example, we have what we call stokvels in this country, but which are basically circles of trust among many women. And I know that you have them across the Caribbean, you have them across many parts of Southern Europe, I think, but mainly, particularly in the majority world across India, where there's a group of 12 people who will come together, and at the end of the year or once a year, it's somebody's turn to be paid out. Now, during COVID, what this did, it meant that people were guaranteed to some extent the opportunity not to lose their homes, for example, the opportunity not to lose their cars, for example, the opportunity to ensure that children's school fees were paid. So kind of as a solidarity economic model, without calling it solidarity economics. So around food production and bartering of food and many other things. And another piece of that, before I also hand over to Rosebell, is that on a broader macro level, it reminded us of how vacuous GDP is as a measure. And I think many people in this call would agree with that. But it was vacuous particularly because it didn't understand that at a time of global crisis and human suffering, that cannot be said to be good growth. And people were peeved, and capitalism was peeved with this moment, this bump in the road, rather than having an reflective moment to see that this is a crisis upon many crises. This was the culmination of the many decades and even centuries of crisis that Rosebell and I have narrated this evening. It was at the inevitable implosion of capitalism and capitalist neoliberalism, and yet we keep having these warnings, and I think the next one won't even be as gentle. And COVID was not gentle at all. But I think the next ones, when the environment starts getting angry at us and so on, when not only people are angry at each other through war, but when nature also begins to turn on us, it will be even more difficult, because there is no vaccine against. So I think the community-centeredness is a model that many of us have been seeing, and including Thobile in Makers Valley, where you work and live. which I've written about, but it's an excellent model as well, because it's really a community of people who are migrant. So what I find exciting about it is that it is creating a new form of non-state citizenship, non-state belonging. And I think that is also something that in a well-being world, in building heterodox alternatives to the state, frankly, circumventing the state if we can. These are the sorts of communities of care, the communities of practice, the communities of love that we need to create, because the state as an institution is toxic and has not been seen to be in good faith for the most part. Rosebell?
Go ahead, Rosebell. I wanted to say in between, Liepollo, if you find that AU link, please do share it. I also wanted you've got it. Oh, you put it in. Oh, awesome. And shout out to PGI in terms of the Stokvel. There was an article by one of the fellows last year of a variety of Stokvel finance examples. So I just wanted to say, I know they're in the crowd if someone wants to share that link as well. But go ahead, Rosebell.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. Definitely, there's a lot to learn. We have seen, like, when you live in a place where the government, for example, when people are talking about a debt crisis, the government of Africa drowning in debt, and something that is made is historic. It is not, yes, you can talk about corruption, which everyone from the outside tends to fixate on, rather than looking at the origins of debt and why we are in debt, in this debt crisis. So for us, for example, debt is not the government debt, country's debt is not just an abstract thing that you see in numbers. We live with these realities. I think of myself every day, every month, what I have to do, what kind of community do I have, or where do I belong? Oftentimes we exist because we survive because we are in different, what we call circles. It could be a circle from your village, from your neighborhood in the town where you're staying. It doesn't even matter. I am from Uganda. I'm living in Senegal right now, but I am part of so many communities in Uganda, both rural and in the urban, in the capital city where I have lived before. So, and I am every day contributing to the well-being to make sure, like, someone in the member of that group, if something happened to them, because we have to survive, because the state system has never really been the state system that provides. And that's why we talk about, like, histories, because the state has never been a state that was made to serve us, right? So, and since the times, we have always survived by, creating communities of care for each other. And there are very few people who can live and survive outside that kind of community that we see. So, for example, when COVID was going on, I actually spent 6 months in my village. I had not really lived there like for 10 years, like I always go there for 3 weeks, 1 month, but I was there for 6 months straight during the lockdowns. It was amazing to see how people were surviving, not only like economically, but actually socially, kind of the kind of activities they would come up with, because suddenly the world had kind of stopped. So the systems that were running them over time, kind of, even when they were worried, they still could stop and make do of the moment with different activities, and seeing how communities were sustaining each other in different activities, because it was a very scary moment. Nobody knew how we're going to get out of it anyway. But this is to show that every day these systems are there and they're running every day. When you come from a country where for example, when you look at the dependency ratio, it's not about your children, it's about the community, the people in your community, whether they have what they need. So you're every day participating in that. And I think it's very important to know that in different communities in Africa, women run most of the the organized circles, like economic circles, money lending businesses. They're, from a long time ago. They're the women I know. When I was going to school, like where my mom would go to borrow money for my school fees, would be women's small village circles, and they managed to pull money together and address everyday issues that they have, from health to death, to school fees, to anything, you name it, to weddings. So it's very, very important to understand the strength of, the systems we have inherited, but also to understand the threats to that kind of system. So for example, when you see approaches to financial inclusion of women, which come to, this kind of inclusion that's come to get to these circles of sustenance of people and leave them in debt. So that debt is not only at the national level, that debt, everybody's looking for someone to get into debt, literally, So we see the resistance, the constant resistance by these community groups to actually sustain themselves and overcome the crisis they're in. So we have to remember that every day there's ways of organizing outside the economy that we've been presented like. So people survive every day with that, and majority of the people survive on that. So it's very important to remember that often what is termed as informal, because it's called informal with the intention to bring them into the system where you can tax them and burden them further, is what we call informal has always worked and has always been there and working for the people. They every day resist many ways to be brought into the formal system, where then full-on extraction happens every day. Not to say that they live outside extraction, but there are different ways people have always resisted to continue to live, to serve their communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Powerful. Yeah, me and Liepollo were just messaging in the chat that this hour has just flown by. And there are like a multitude of questions and interesting perspectives on the chat. But we're going to use some of the questions to kind of give some wrapping up thoughts. And also perhaps part 2 of this, just depending on availability or thoughts, will have to be coming along soon as well. So stay tuned for that. But in terms of what you're seeing in the chat, some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A in terms of what are your views on the way forward for the African continent, and specifically speaks about resource extraction, and how we can use our resources to better the lives of our people. Some of the things we were thinking about is allyship. How do we build bridges? Obviously there is this minority world, majority world binary. How do we move past that? And what are some practical ways that this audience can be part of that? And what are your visions, I guess, in terms of the evolution of feminist economics for Africa and the world? What is some of your hopes and your vision towards the future? So I know that's a lot, fully loaded, jam-packed question. But if you can bring some of those strands in, so we can be speaking to some of those comments in the chat. And then please note, the other questions we hopefully will bring in for a session 2 or part 2 of this conversation. So any thoughts on that, Liepollo or Rosebell? Who wants to go first?
Rosebell, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry, you muted. There we
Please
go.
go ahead.
Okay, I will. So, there's a lot there. So there's a bit, I think, around how we divest from this whole notion of the other, the center and the periphery, which I think is really, really important, especially if we're thinking around decolonizing development, but I think it's an understanding of privilege and position, which is really important. It requires the recognition of why some voices carry power and authority and what informs and populates that power and authority. It's often maleness, it's often racialized, it's often regionalized as well. And I think, you know, for us to be able to do this work, and I think going back to what I said previously around what are we developing towards and who needs to perhaps seed the most. And I think one of the things that the minority world will do well is in centering voices like many others. I mean, Rosebell and I are like two in a universe of many you know, discursive, important voices in an African feminist universe. And I think that centering this African feminist universe requires a couple of things, and this is partly to respond to what Vasna is asking. It requires an understanding of the historiography and herstiography of colonization and imperialism and extractivism, and I think a reshaping and an upending of who is owed what, and who is the primary producer and who is the primary consumer. The other thing is the disproportionality between who has been producing and who has been consuming. And African women, Black and brown women have been by far subsidizing the rest of humanity. And I think that a narrative and an understanding and an ontology that appreciates this as a center departing point would make our research, our policy work, our framing of international relations, international economics, international politics, national politics, entirely different. And I can't say much more than that because we've got a minute to go, and I'd like to give Rosebell the rest of the time to wrap up.
Thank you so much. I think it's very important to know that any visions, we have to continue our eyes and the focus on economic and ecological liberation is the center. Without those two, there's nothing. You know, that is where our eyes continue to stay, and reminding ourselves of what really true solidarity can look like. And we've been giving examples of how really, even in the digital world, how we see a lot of women, for example, in Africa, leading in opening businesses, in running businesses. And oftentimes, for example, in Uganda, 1 in 3 businesses is women run 1 in 3 businesses, something like that. So they really occupy a very important, not only what is seen as the majority, but also emerging trends of where women are exerting themselves and using the skills they can get, and the digital economy, bringing in a whole different set of both opportunity, but also in terms of entrenching inequalities that we see. So we saw in the lockdowns, many women opened businesses, but how do they sustain those businesses after we know, like, most times women don't have access to funds, and the funds that are brought to them, they really require a lot of security, and most African women don't own land. Land is a big security in the world, not only for countries, but even on a family level. So understanding that requires an intersectional approach to really to righting the wrongs, because how are we going to really guarantee anyone's well-being when the very land we're on does not belong to us, according to a redefined colonial approach to ownership, right? But also remembering the kind of looking to the margins, always looking to the margins, not to appropriate the margins, but really, and co-opt them, but really genuinely find what has sustained them. I remind many of my African colleagues often, like, how imagine what it's like to be an African queer person, criminalized, not being able to live in your own community, true to yourself. But how many of those communities are actually thriving against all these odds? Can we even be humble to learn from them, or we are forever looking at them as the victim, just to remembering that people are not just, it's not one dimension, that people are affected by so many different oppressions, but they also have many capabilities and tools that they have developed internally that might not even be available for those who are in the center. And we have to look to the margins, and we have to look there with intention to learn, with intention to get the knowledge and the very people with the knowledge, and put them at the center and let them, teach us how to go forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just seeing Donnie's is getting the fiery quotes from the both of you and putting them into the chat. So there's a wealth of just beautiful things that you've shared in the chat, and also just such beautiful comments and suggestions in terms of what we can bring to a part 2 of this conversation. Clearly, it is something that people are wanting to explore even further. And yeah, just really appreciate, I wanted to end off on this screen so we can see one another again. Really just appreciate your time. And I know we are going a little bit over. And I think a big thing of this, it's tricky because we really want to have the space and the platform for us to be able to understand and build empathy, like just beyond empathy, there's a real need for understanding before we can move on to like the forward thinking solutions. And hopefully this has kind of brought us to this place of some of the challenges. And this was like spitfire, very fast kind of history in terms of the experiences of Liepollo and Rosebell and some of their thoughts in terms of where we could go in the future. But definitely think this part 2 is needed to kind of unpack some of these practical things that people are wanting to explore. So thank you so much for your questions. Next, WEAll talk is going to be with around inner development. And I think, again, it speaks to a lot of what has come through in this conversation, that we need to develop together in order to be able to vision together. And so I'm really excited about that for next month. But I'm thinking May could potentially be part 2, but of course this is based on the availability of our speakers as well. Yeah, really just want to say, please do look at the chat. There's a wealth of information, links, concept notes, papers, incredible resources that are there. So please do have a look at that. We will definitely obviously share this recording and also hopefully reshare some of those links as well. So I'm going to end it there, even though it feels like so hard to just close, but really just want to say thank you once again to everybody for joining, and hopefully we'll see you for part 2.
Thank you
Bye,
so much.
everybody. Bye. And a huge, huge thank you to our speakers. I am
Thank
just
you.
blown away
Goodbye.
as usual.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank